A nation can survive its fools, and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within.
Hey, they've been wrong about the wars. They've been wrong about jobs. They've been wrong about everything. The question is, are they stupid or do they have a plan? I actually think for the most part, they have a plan, but some are not too smart.
Welcome to the Horrible Deplorable Show, the anti-globalist America First program dedicated to dehoaxing the media and destroying the narrative. Here's your host, the founder and editor of the Daily Stir, Matt Wingard.
Welcome to the Horrible Deplorable Show. My name is Matt Wingard, and with me as always is my good friend Doris. Hello, Doris.
Hello, Matt.
Welcome to the Gab community. You can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Pocket Cast, and we play on the weekends on the 405media.com at 5 p.m. both Saturday and Sunday. So, Trump was wiretapped. That's what's come out this week, and I'm both surprised and not surprised at the media reaction. They, of course, have egg on their face, and they all spent a lot of time ridiculing that whole idea. And so, of course, they're doing what they do when they hate a story, which is they report it for about 24 hours as lightly as possible and then quickly try to move on to something else. When they really care about a story, they do second stories and follow-up stories and the next day stories and weekend wrap-up stories, and they keep hammering away on something for weeks or months at a time. This one is particularly upsetting to me because I think it's more than just a story. What we have here now is more than the suggestion. We have mounting evidence that key members of the Obama administration were involved routinely in spying on American citizens, spying on journalists, and spying on their political opponents. This is as stark a violation of your democracy and of free people as you can possibly get. The most powerful organs in the government are the intelligence agencies. They are given wide latitude to do all sorts of nefarious things, up into including murder. They really overseas, you hope. But the point is that they are, by their very nature, the dark arts. They are the most dangerous organizations that exist within a free society, and they must be tightly controlled. And we've had evidence over the decades of malfeasance and inappropriate actions by the CIA and others. And for the most part, though, that's always been reacted to very severely. And there have been extensive hearings, and at times there have been major locks and chains put on the intel agencies as a result of the kind of malfeasance that doesn't even come close to what we now know has been happening over the last decade or so in the United States. And yet, because this is liberals doing this, and the media runs cover for them, and because it's Obama and his administration, and because they're so far gone politically and ideologically that they can no longer find anything that looks like neutral, we are not getting the outrage on this that we should. But not only is this an Obama scandal, one of 200, 300 Obama scandals, that whole criminal organization was the most scandal-plagued administration in modern history, and yet the least reported. The myth that the media gives is that they were the cleanest administration in recent memory, and the exact opposite is the truth. But beyond the fact that this is an Obama scandal, this cuts to the absolute core of our freedoms, of our image of ourselves as Americans standing for something, or that we have some freedom of movement and of word and deed. We are completely monitored, and our intelligence agencies have run completely amok. And we've reached the bottom of that now, which is when the people who are currently in power, in this case it was the Obama administration, use these dark arts and these agencies on their own citizens, and they use it on their own political opponents. There's no stage beyond that, folks. That's the end. And you can see now that what has happened is that they never for a second believed that Donald Trump was going to be president of the United States. Never for a second. And so they did all these things believing that Hillary Clinton would be elected and that it would never come to light. All of her people would take over, which would be either be the same people under Obama or the baton would be handed to like-minded villains, and this would never have seen the light of day. And they were obviously freaked out on Election Day last year when Trump won, and that's why they began the whole Russian narrative to try to distract and to create projection and maybe even to give people time to try to bury some of this information. But it can't be buried, and it can't be swept under the rug. It cannot be treated like a one-day story or a one-week story. This must be dealt with in the most ruthless terms, or it is a huge turning point for the United States of America. The people involved in this, key people, appear to be Susan Rice, John Brennan, and Samantha Power. If they are not arrested, and arrested soon, if they are not frog-marched in public so that everybody, so that they're made an example of, and everybody within the D.C. swamp sees that this is going to be taken seriously, if they are not charged with multiple crimes, convicted, and put in prison, then the message is clear, and it will happen again. And no one should be surprised if people in the Trump administration end up doing the same thing, and whoever comes after the Trump administration does the same. This will become the new normal. It cannot be allowed to continue. And I am looking at Jeff Sessions at this point, and I am relying on Jeff Sessions to clean out the FBI and the Department of Justice from anybody who was even remotely connected to this activity and did not report it. And that will probably mean a lot of key high-level people have to go, not necessarily because they were involved in the activity, but they knew that it happened, or they performed their job of unmasking, and they just did it as a matter of routine because it was requested from on high, and they did not report their superiors. It is the same as a soldier who witnesses a war crime and who is not necessarily a part of the war crime, but sits on that information, says nothing. You are obligated when it comes to these kinds of high crimes and misdemeanors, these acts of treason against the body politic, you are obligated to report that at the cost of your career. It does not matter. And so Jeff Sessions needs to arrest the people who were involved themselves, and they must be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. But he also must ultimately find out everyone whose fingers touch this, every bureaucrat, every person who basically went along with this high crime or just did their job, performed their function, and never reported what was happening. And every one of them must be ushered out of civil service. Every one of them must be expelled from the government. And only if that is done would you send the kind of signal that you need to, that we are not going down that path as a country, and we are not going to allow that behavior for a second. Sadly, I do not believe that is what is going to happen. I don't believe a single person is going to be arrested, let alone charged with a crime. No one will be expelled. And therefore, I cannot, in any stronger terms, tell you what a dark moment this is for the country. And I'm not prone to exaggeration or to hyperventilation on things normally, but this is real. This is serious. These are the intelligence agencies of the United States who basically have carte blanche power to act as a Gestapo, if we allow them to, acting as such. Eavesdropping on citizens. Eavesdropping on reporters. Cheryl Atkinson, who used to work for CBS, now has this show Full Measure. She has a great column in thehill.com. I encourage everyone to go and read it. She's involved in a long-term lawsuit with the government because she believes that her computer was intruded during the Obama administration by intelligence officials. And they are trying desperately to stop that. The Jeff Sessions DOJ is involved in fighting that lawsuit right now. And worst of all, among the list of citizens and journalists is political opponents. And I'm not saying this because it was Trump. When the people who have ultimate pinnacle power in your country can use the agencies of the government to fight off a political opponent, that's when you've achieved third world status. You do not have free and fair elections, which are the absolute cornerstone of any democracy, in this case our republic. It does not matter that it was Obama doing it to Trump. It wouldn't matter who A was and who B was. When the people who have power in the federal government are using federal agencies during a campaign to try to sabotage and thwart their opponent, you have reached the bottom level, the red alert zone, the absolute point of no return. And this is a dangerous, dangerous moment. And I don't think that Jeff Sessions fully understands that or is taking the action that he needs to. And I say this as somebody who is a huge admirer of Jeff Sessions, but it is a catastrophic mistake that our future generations will woe the day that this was not taken as seriously as it needs to be.
You know, recently Sessions went out to Oregon and told him what he thought about sanctuary cities. So I'd like to see a little action instead of just talk.
I couldn't agree more. So POTUS is endorsing Luther Strange in the Senate race down there in Alabama against Judge Moore. And I know that's created a little consternation out there. I want to try to explain this. We have to recognize as Trump supporters that in some circumstances he is, or at least he feels, that he's caught in a little bit of a vice. Remember that Luther Strange is someone who voted the way Donald Trump wanted him to on repeal and replace. You have to believe that as part of his constant calling of senators to round up votes, the thing that Luther Strange probably asked for, because everyone asks for something, is he wanted Trump's support in his election campaign. And so the president was in trade mode, I'm sure, and Mitch McConnell as well, and they were giving whatever they possibly could to get the votes they needed to get to 51, which of course they didn't get. But the point is, the president, I'm absolutely sure, made some kind of deal with Strange to support him in his re-election in exchange for that vote and probably other votes, because as far as I can tell, Strange has voted exactly the way the president wants him to. So I fully support Alabama Trump voters voting for Moore, and I think they should do that. But let's not blame the president too much for following through on what I'm sure was a deal he made for votes. He just has to do that, and therefore he has to kind of go through the motions of supporting him. But I don't really see, other than a couple of tweets, and he's going to come out on Friday and do a rally, but he's not breaking his back to try to get Luther Strange elected. He's doing what I believe he's probably agreed to do, and we shouldn't blame him for that because he's there trying to make deals to get things done, and he has to do that. It's up to us to ignore that when we know that he's just doing his job, and we've got to do ours, which is to defeat Luther Strange. And I'm talking to all the listeners in Alabama, and elect Judge Moore. Now, this has two really good effects. First of all, this is McConnell's candidate, and McConnell has backed him, and therefore some of his prestige is on this. Defeating Strange is a defeat of McConnell, and it will imperil his leadership, and that is not a bad thing at all. The other thing it does is it sends a good signal to Donald Trump. Now, some may say it hurts him because he made an endorsement, and then suddenly his endorsement was not heeded. But I actually think, for whatever slight negative there is to that, there's a lot more positive on the side of defeating McConnell and scaring the hell out of a bunch of Republican senators. There's already talk that a couple of senators may not run for re-election if Strange is defeated, because they will then be convinced that there is this backlash coming and they want to get clear of it. This could include Bob Corker in Tennessee. So there are upsides to sending this strong message. The president will get the message. He'll get over the fact that the guy he endorsed, that he's a little humiliated by that, and he will see that there is this tidal wave, this pushback from the hinterlands in support of real change, and that will give him a little bit more courage to break with congressional Republicans next year and endorse perhaps some primary opponents. So there are a number of really good reasons to defeat the incumbent in Alabama. But that is why I believe the president is doing what he's doing. In the end, he'll be fine. So I want to make a correction from last week. I said that the Bannon interviews on Charlie Rose were 3 parts. It turns out they broke that up into 5 parts. You can find all 5 parts by going to charlierose.com, and I highly encourage everyone to sit down and watch them. If you only have time for one, watch part 5, which I watched last night. It's about 30 minutes, and there are at least 3 different moments where Bannon just goes off on tirade, which is glorious. And he's not only shutting down Charlie Rose, but he is this primal scream from the American electorate that is just wonderful. So check that out and don't miss it. By the way, in that interview, Bannon made it very clear that he is going to bring a strong primary challenge to Bob Corker in Tennessee. So I was very heartened to hear that. We already have an opponent against Flake. We have an opponent against Heller. And what I heard in the Bannon interview was a straight-out guarantee that there will be a strong opponent against Bob Corker in Tennessee. So we are very close and well on our way to having the 3 races filled that I have been asking for in order to send the message to the Republican Senate that needs to be sent. So Trump was at the UN giving a speech that got a lot of attention. I thought the greatest moment was when he referred to the North Korean dictator as Rocket Man. From the dais at the UN, he called him Rocket Man. It was just glorious, just wonderful. I mean, sometimes the president can just ping the tilt button up to, on a scale of 1 to 10 to 11 for me, because it's like masterful trolling and branding all at the same time. And it's causing all the right people to pearl clutch and to get the vapors because he's saying those things at the UN. How could he do that at the UN? Such an august body filled with tin pot dictators and murderers and all the rest. He was very clear about North Korea. Now, I personally believe that all of the saber rattling about North Korea is a tactic, and there will not be any military intervention in North Korea. But all the right people, all the wrong people, I suppose, who constantly have to jump on the president before they have their facts, were claiming that, his claim that we could destroy North Korea was extreme, and how dare a president do that, and that's just unchained. And then immediately within 24 hours, good researchers had found links to stories in which both Obama and Clinton had publicly said that we could destroy North Korea and that they should be careful. So essentially the president had not said anything different than previous presidents had said, but all the MSNBC crybabies and the rest, had to get all worked up. He was also very strong on Iran, and apparently the Iranians didn't like that. Tough. There's a movement among the left in the United States to try to revamp the image of the Iranians, and I find that disconcerting. They have not changed their ways, but I have noticed it, and we'll talk a little bit later about how that's appearing in Hollywood.
Well, he emphasized that there were several threats or enemies to the free world, calling North Korea a deprived regime. Those were my favorite words. And Hillary called that speech dark and dangerous, but I thought it was his best speech yet. I mean, he called for security, prosperity, and peace, all of which the sovereign nations could attain if they wanted to.
It was a pretty good speech, written by Stephen Miller, again, the good America First conservative and nationalist that is left in the White House. The one big applause line he seemed to get was when he said that he would always put America first because he's going to always put his citizens first, and that you, looking at all the members, you should put your people first as well. And they wildly applauded at that idea. So this idea of borders and national identity and looking out for your own citizens is obviously quite popular. And it is the key to peace and prosperity in the world. The alternative, which is pushed by the globalists, is kind of a Star Trek-like future, this idea that there will be a one-world government like the Federation one day and that everybody will live in harmony. My argument would be that if in some distant future we do have a unified world, it won't be because there's some centrally run government in one place dictating. That will lead to revolution and anger and resentment and breakaways, and it will lead to international civil war, because if you have one world government, then any fighting that occurs is obviously a civil war of some kind. We'll have massive civil war. The key to any kind of future in which the world's at peace is to respect people's boundaries and their cultures and let them form basically an international republic over time. And it will probably take hundreds of years, but the idea is that there is something we actually failed to do in the United States, which is to create a limited overall government and allow the states to maintain their power. That eroded over time. So if it's going to be tried again, ultimately at an international level, there are a lot of more constitutional protections that will have to be put in to protect the member nations. But ultimately, allowing people to be mostly governed at the local level, and then to contribute to international endeavors like space travel, what have you. I'm kind of following the Star Trek methodology. That's if there's going to be international peace, that's the future out there that can be achieved. This idea that you can bring everybody under one government is a recipe for disaster, absolute disaster. And you can see it in the large governments that have formed. I mean, the bickering that's going on, and there's now an independence movement in Catalonia in Spain, the bickering that's going on in the EU, because they have this government that has formed with a lot of unelected people in it. So the reason for Brexit, and there will probably be others, is the sense that folks are getting in these individual countries that this EU government is completely unattached to them, that it doesn't care about their interests, and that it has its own agenda. And as these larger governments get bigger and more powerful, that's exactly how people down below feel about them. And it leads to conflict.
Well, what do you think China's going to do about North Korea? Anything?
I think the president's pressure is working. He's managed to cleverly maneuver the Chinese into a box now where they are, they're alternately claiming they have absolutely no influence over North Korea, and yet North Korea is their creature. We've talked about this before. North Korea is a creation of the Chinese, and they've always think of it as China is this house, and they have a rabid dog chained up to a spike in the front lawn designed to keep people away. North Korea is that chained dog. And so, what the Chinese do whenever they're unhappy with American activity in the Pacific or influence, or they're unhappy with Japan, or they're unhappy in Korea, is they go out and they let the chain loose by another foot, you see, or they just rattle the chain, or they throw a piece of meat out in front of the dog. And the dog goes crazy and acts out and scares the bejesus out of the neighbors, and rinse, repeat. This cycle just goes over and over and over again. So I have no doubt that the Chinese have a plan for taking down the North Korean regime. They've always had a plan, I'm sure, to bring that to an end or to put down their dog if they feel they no longer have control over it. So they claim they have no control, while at the same time they have to exercise some control, and that puts them in the box. Second of all, North Korea is completely isolated economically, except for the illegal activity that it does internationally, which involves illicit trade and everything that's illegal, essentially drugs, guns, the rest. But they also they sell coal into China, and they have this relationship. 80% of their economy is dependent on China. And so China is now forced to go to the UN and support these sanctions measures, which essentially are sanctions on them because they're the only ones doing any legitimate economic activity with the North Koreans. The president has them boxed in, and every time the North Koreans act out, the president increases the pressure. And I saw today that the Chinese announced that they would be ending or curtailing banking relationships with the North Koreans, while at the same time they claim they have no influence over the country. So they're running out of options. The dog is no longer intimidating the neighbor, because essentially Trump has said, I see that your dog's on a chain. If you want to let him off the chain, I'm going to kill him instantly. Otherwise, just rattling his chain and throwing meat in front of him and trying to scare me isn't going to work anymore, because I believe that you have full control over that beast. And he's basically called the Chinese bluff. And they're running out of runway on this. So they're now calling for six-party talks. I think they're looking for a way out, because the president has systematically laid the groundwork for basically, China, I'm going to hold you responsible for everything North Korea does. And while I may not be able to punish them economically, I can punish you. And the Chinese can't have it. I mean, I think ultimately we get to a place where the Chinese want to solve this problem. They're not there yet, but they will want to. But then you need to give them a face-saving way to do that. They need to be able to solve the North Korean problem without it looking like they capitulated to the president. And I don't exactly know how that plane lands on the runway without wheels, but that's what's got to happen. So that's the end game I'd be looking for, is when ultimately does a door open that allows the Chinese out of this box, with their head held high. And I think whatever the solution is, you'll see the United States will play along with the narrative. They'll play along with the storyline that the Chinese put out so that everybody can pretend that the Chinese did not capitulate on this issue. So we have the Graham-Cassidy last attempt. This is a bill that is the last attempt by the Senate Republicans to repeal and replace Obamacare. Doris, I know you've been following this a little bit closer than I have. What are the details of what's inside the bill?
Well, first of all, it ends the individual mandate that you have to have insurance, and then if you don't, you would have to pay a penalty.
So this is the mandate that the Trump administration is already not enforcing, but still exists in law, and they would be repealing that.
Exactly. And instead, the states would get back a lump sum to structure their health insurance program however they want. The problem that the opponents are having with this is there is a sentence or two in the bill that allows pre-existing conditions and caps on lifetime payments that you can ask for a waiver. So that's the sticking point on it.
I'm pretty sure, though, that the language in that bill probably has some... In other words, in order to qualify for the waiver, you have to have some kind of alternative high-risk insurance pool. You have to be able to prove that you have an alternative way of dealing with folks who have pre-existing conditions so that they can receive medical care.
That's true, but it doesn't require you to offer it at premium levels people can afford.
Well, I think they're gonna flood the zone with money on this. That's one of the ways they're gonna get over. The other thing is the bill doesn't even take effect till 2020. So a lot of people are going to harp about the negative aspects or the positive aspects, and there's going to be a whole campaign cycle blaming and finger pointing and trying to cast aspersions, but nothing's actually going to change on the ground because the bill doesn't take effect until 2020.
Well, Pence said the whole concept is built on the American principle of federalism.
Right.
And if we don't pass it, what we're going to be doing is a rush to socialism where single-payer health care is controlled by D.C.
And Bernie Sanders already released his socialized health care bill, and that got about 17 Democrats in the Senate to sign on. So that's just the floor. I mean, it'll be 17 this year, and it'll be something more than that next year, and the momentum will continue to build until they have the votes for government-run and controlled health care. I've said this before, that if Republicans don't... This is part of the scandal of them promising for 8 years to repeal and replace Obamacare. It isn't just a broken promise or ineptitude. It is the fact that if they do not pass an alternative plan, if they don't put us on a trajectory of individual health savings accounts in which Americans control their own health care, then there is no middle ground forever. Ultimately, we will have complete and total socialized medicine in this country. And I've said this repeatedly, that if the Republicans don't begin moving the healthcare system in the direction that they want it to go, then it will continue moving in the direction that it is going, which is towards Bernie Sanders' ultimate goal of socialized medicine. It is inevitable. The only question is just how long it will take. 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, whatever the number is, I don't know. But it will happen, and it will happen in most people's lifetimes if Republicans don't get off their asses and get moving on this.
Well, I guess what I've heard is McConnell is working on McCain to get him to vote yes. So will it be interesting to see what McCain does on this?
We've talked about this, Doris and I. I believe that because McCain is dying and doesn't believe that he's going to be running again in 6 years, he feels totally free to do whatever he wants, and what he wanted to do was to punish the president, because McCain is a guy who holds grudges. The worst Republican senator in the entire history of the Republican Party. I have absolutely no respect for the man whatsoever. Do not like him. I could go on and on about that. It's unnecessary. Most of you share the same viewpoint, but it was entirely personal. I think he was providing some cover for some colleagues, but ultimately he was motivated for personal reasons. It was a chance to tweak the president, to deny him a huge win. And yes, John McCain is that petty. He is that small of a person. Absolutely. So the answer to your question, Doris, is that if he feels he took his pound of flesh, then he'll probably vote with it now, because he's already dealt the blow that he wanted to. If he intends to keep his foot on the neck here, then he could continue to be a stumbling block and drag his friends down with him in his little pursuit of personal vengeance. The president has tweeted about ending the filibuster rule. I know that McConnell has absolutely no interest in that, but I'm going to make an argument for why it should go. I understand the institutional desires of the senators. On both sides of the aisle, they like the 60-vote rule. They have a bunch of privileges there that I don't think people stop and think about. When a president nominates a federal judge from a certain district or state, both of the senators, regardless of the party, both senators have to agree to that person's nomination. So usually there's a negotiation. If the president's of one party and the local senators are another party, then the president really can't get away with a really conservative judge, or a judge, I guess in my example, it doesn't matter which party. The president can't pick somebody who's really ideologically aligned with them, or the senators will block it. Now, sometimes there are trades done, so someone who's ideologically aligned gets let in for somebody who isn't over there, and they may, put together a package of 20 or 30 judges' names, each side getting some of what they want, and that goes through. But the point is that the senators, each individual senator has a lot of power, and they can put holds on presidential nominations until they get some desire filled, and it can have absolutely nothing to do with that person's nomination. The 60-vote margin reinforces that senatorial club. Ultimately, the truth about the Senate is that they all look out for each other. They don't look out for each other because they like that, the conservative doesn't do it because he likes that ultra-liberal from Vermont, and the ultra-liberal from Oregon doesn't do it, enforce the rules and support them because he likes that ultra-conservative from Alabama. They do it because the rules make them all powerful. And if either side trades away those rules, then they all lose the power. So that's why there's this resistance, no matter which party's in power, to not give up on the 60-vote rule, because it creates and enforces these 100 senators as the most powerful people in the country. And once you're in the club, you're of the club, and you protect the club. The first rule of Senate Club is you don't get rid of the rules that help the Senate Club, and you don't talk about Senate Club, right? I was mangling a quote from Fight Club. So that is why there's all this institutional resistance to this. Now, my argument in favor of this is that I believe the Democrats are going to do it eventually anyway. And the reason I think we're on a collision course for the end of that is because that 60-vote rule worked a lot better when the differences between the two parties were not extreme. And I'm not suggesting that there aren't differences between the parties, and that there haven't been over 100 and 200 years. But there was a lot that united folks. Remember that there used to be a rule that nobody criticized the president on foreign policy while they were overseas, right? So when senators were traveling and they were interviewed in Turkey, or if they were in France, or if they were in Argentina on some trip, and local press asked them a critical question of the president, senators would never disagree with the president. Even if they did disagree with the president, they would never do that on foreign soil. There used to be this phrase that partisanship ends at the shoreline. Well, that stopped about 30 years ago. And now it's not uncommon for senators to openly criticize the president, whether it's, a Republican criticizing Obama while he's overseas, or someone criticizing George W. Bush or Trump while they're overseas. The point is that thing was broken years ago. And it is little things like that. I could sit here and list a bunch of things, but it is little things like that that used to unify members of our politics. Certain lines they wouldn't cross. That, we're a family and we agree on all of these big things and we disagree about these little things and we argue about them. Well, that has changed. People in our Congress now represent two very extreme ideologies. They've been forming for 100 years, but now they've really started. The reason why it seems so stark now is because our side is demanding an actual fight. What's been happening is Republicans have been surrendering to the international communist/socialist movement for over 100 years. And now that we want people like Trump who will actually fight them, and we're looking to expel the Lindsey Grahams and the John McCains who've been surrendering to them, now everybody says, oh, it's like a civil war. All that's happening is both sides are now fighting, because one side has been fighting like mad for 100 years. The other side is now simply engaged in trying to protect Western civilization and the core Judeo-Christian values that built our societies, which are under withering attack. So the battle is engaged. I say all of that to simply make the point that as we begin to clear out the deadwood in our Republican Party, this climate of hostility between the two sides is only going to get more stark. It needs to, if you believe in these fights, it needs to. And I've talked in the past about how you have to gird yourself to this and not be so willing to look for comedy or bipartisanship, because that's almost always a surrender. I wish, bipartisan, this goes to the point I'm trying to make. Bipartisanship works when the differences are slight. If you put Rand Paul and John McCain and Susan Collins in a room and ask them to come up with a repeal measure, they can negotiate, even though they don't agree on some very big things. They can negotiate and come to a compromise. But you put Nancy Pelosi and Rand Paul, or Nancy Pelosi and a Donald Trump or a Jeff Sessions in a room to negotiate on immigration or healthcare or anything else, there is no way that any bipartisan agreement could be a good thing. No way. They are too far apart. Somebody has to surrender in order for that to result in an actual bill. When you're that far apart, defeat is the only outcome that works. It's like trying to negotiate with Stalin or Hitler. You're too far apart. And I'm not making a comparison of Pelosi to Hitler. I'm simply trying to make the historical point that when the difference between two sides is within a certain range, a negotiation can happen. But when the difference between two sides is too far apart, then negotiation is simply a subterfuge. It's a delaying tactic, and it is not actually solving the problem. And I'm the last person who would want to see violence or war or anything like that. I don't want to see that. And war is evil, but it is not the worst thing. War is the second worst thing. The worst thing is slavery. All of which is to say that the 60-vote rule doesn't work as these sides have drifted apart. It is a recipe for complete stalemate and inaction. And in that case, it favors the left because they have full control of the bureaucracy. They have infiltrated the judiciary. The kind of stuff that's coming out. Look at what's happening on immigration. All of these judges who are making up laws in order to try to stifle the president's immigration and refugee policy. And what's going to happen at the Supreme Court is that they're going to back the president up. Ultimately, they're going to say that, look, the Constitution's clear on this. The president has wide authority. And when they do that, all of these judges in Hawaii and in the Ninth Circus and all the rest are going to be shown to be complete judicial activists who were simply using their power to delay the rightful authority of the president to enforce immigration laws. That's not a judiciary that anybody should respect. That's a judiciary that should be held in contempt because they're essentially acting as little fiefdoms, letting pass through their court that which they personally like and stopping in their courts that which they do not like. That's not a judge. That's a king. And so the 60-vote rule doesn't work, and people like McConnell can cling to it all they want. But ultimately, we have to use every tool at our disposal to try to save this republic. And we have the majority votes to move things, and we should be moving them. So I want to make a point about this. First of all, I want to be clear from the outset that I totally agree with Ann Coulter and others who are picking on the president right now to try to keep him honest on things like DACA and immigration. That's totally cool as far as I'm concerned, to continue to make your point, to raise the flag and say, look, I'm not moving off of this and I'm going to criticize you if you move. The president made promises. He needs to fulfill those promises. And I think that he does listen to what's going on in social media and the rest. And so I want people to keep him honest by continuing to remind him of the things that he said on the campaign trail. I think that's all fair game. But I want to draw a distinction between those on our side. And I consider our side to be everything that's anti-left. And there are lots of different groups in all sorts of forms, and some on the far extreme, who would fall under this category of anti-left. We do not always have to agree with each other. And sometimes people in our very, very broad anti-left coalition are going to say and do extreme things. Absolutely, that's going to happen in any broad coalition. And I'm not suggesting that they shouldn't be condemned. When people do or say extreme things, they should be condemned. Or at least I'll put it this way. If you believe that what they said was extreme and that you want to condemn it, you should. Anybody in the coalition should do that. Here's my point. You can condemn and move on. And then there is standing up on a soapbox and spending a half an hour condemning somebody to try to bring attention to yourself or to make it about you. And once you understand this rule, you can see it clearly within the coalition. Who actually is trying to advance the cause against the left and who isn't within the coalition? Who is sort of firing from within to try to hobble the movement against the anti-left and to advance the goals of the left. And it's not, you can tell who these people are, not by whether they criticize someone within the coalition or not, but how they go about doing it. When somebody does something extreme and you see someone in our coalition say, that's wrong, I don't agree with it. Meanwhile, I want to talk about X. That's someone who is part of the anti-left coalition. When somebody says, I think what they did was wrong, and I'm now going to spend the next 20 minutes telling you that they're the worst people in the world, and that this is a call to arms, and that we have to tell them in no uncertain terms that what they did is wrong, and what they did is wrong, and what they did is wrong, and 200 more times what they did is wrong. That person is not a part of the anti-left coalition. That is a person that is in it for their own ego and for the advancement of their own personal brand, and in many cases, they are assisting the left on purpose, because they're behind the lines and they are wreaking havoc. I think you all know the forms in which this can take, and I want to make this point again. I am not suggesting that people in the very broad anti-left coalition don't do lots of things that we wouldn't want them to do. People will commit violence, people will say things, people will say they believe in certain things, which I'm going to think are atrocious, and they should be condemned. I'm saying flat out they should be condemned. And I'm saying they should be condemned sincerely. But the difference between somebody that wants to condemn them but continue to move forward to oppose the left is one sentence. And someone who wants more than just to condemn them, but to actually force us all to waste time in conducting a circular firing squad so that the left can advance their causes, that's the person who goes out of their way to draw attention to themselves. And you can see it. If you watch, if you think about what I've just said, and you spend the next week watching, you can tell who's a sincere member of the anti-left coalition and who's just in it for themselves. So, back on the DACA issue again, I want to make this point again that part of the reason why the Graham-Cassidy bill might pass is that Republicans realize they cannot move anything on DACA. And I'm talking about the traitor Republicans. They know, people like Mitch McConnell, know that they cannot move anything on DACA while they fail to do anything for U.S. citizens. That will be a recipe for most of them facing the firing squad politically in primaries next year. So I think that's part of why they want to move Graham-Cassidy is to be able to claim that they've done something on the healthcare issue so that they can move some other stuff. I still think that DACA should be opposed. I'm not convinced that the president's going to betray us on this, and we'll just have to see. But they cannot pass DACA by itself. They cannot do that. They have so failed to pass anything else that I'm counting on the fact that they can't get anything else done. So that means they can't get DACA done. I think they are frozen. And that's part of the reason why we have to improve the caucuses, both the House and the Senate caucuses next year, is because the balance of power within the Republican caucus is apparently too finite at this point. It's too in the middle for them to be able to move it forward. And if we can add just a few more members to both the House and Senate caucus, and I don't mean in actual numbers, I'm talking about changing out wimps for Trump nationalists. If we can change just a few out, I think that will get things moving. Not because the numbers change significantly, but because it sends a very strong message. There are a lot of people in politics that just go with the wind. And you have a lot of Republicans right now that are caught in a vice where they know their votes are coming from Trump nationalists, but their money's coming from the Chamber of Commerce. Most of the money to fund campaigns is coming through these corporate organizations. And so their two masters want two different things. And in order not to upset either one, they've essentially done nothing. Now, of course, that upsets the Trump nationalists, but believe me, it's upsetting. Every small incremental gain that the president is making is upsetting the U.S. Chamber of Commerce as well. So I believe if we can take some scalps, we don't ultimately have to change the membership too much in these caucuses. If we can just execute politically a few of them in the primaries, I think we can convince a large number of people in both the Senate and the House Republican caucuses that their future lies with the Trump nationalist voters and that they'll get their money from somewhere else if need be. And it would actually help. It would, some of this Chamber of Commerce business would move over to the Democrats, if the Democrats will have them. The problem is they've got their own internal civil war coming with the Bernie bros, who want them to become more socialist. That's not something the Chamber of Commerce folks can get on board with. So one of two things happens. Either some of these large corporate interests move over to the Democrats entirely and wholly, and that makes these races financially a little bit more competitive, but I still think the votes are on our side. And it hurts the Democrat brand because they have this sort of socialist for the people brand, and if they marry fully the corporate side of the Chamber of Commerce, then they have an internal problem that makes it impossible for them to advance an agenda or to even campaign on an agenda that anybody will believe. So they might want it for the money, but it becomes very difficult for them to operate as a party when they have the Bernie socialists and the Zuckerberg U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Donahue is the CEO of that organization. When those people are trying to be married to each other, that's a very, very difficult party to try to run, and I think it will further send them into minority status as a party. The other alternative is the chamber finds no home. The U.S. Chamber finds no home, and they sort of break away. Well, I mean, then there's nothing for them at that point, because there are only two parties, the Republican and the Democrat Party, and they are broad coalitions. And if this is the thing that's happening and that the Trump movement is about. It is not ultimately, it may have to be about expelling people from the coalition. That's the last step you take when everything else fails. All we're really trying to do with the Trump America First agenda is to reorganize the order within the Trump coalition. The war hawks have had a primary position in the Republican Party, and the corporatists, the globalists that the chamber represents, have had a primary position. And it's not that the other elements of the Republican Party that Trump represents haven't existed within the Republican Party. They've just been in seat number 3 and seat number 4 and seat number 5. And the whole movement is about moving those folks to seats 1 and 2 and moving the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the war hawks back to seats 3, 4, and 5. And what we're seeing from them, and this is the battle that's going on, is that they may not want to be on the bus if they have to sit in seats 3, 4, and 5. And I think that's going to shake itself out over the next couple years. We need to continue winning elections, but it will shake itself out. And I think ultimately what will happen is that some people will acquiesce and they will sit in those seats at the back of the bus and remain part of the coalition. And other people we just won't. They'll just say, look, if I don't get to sit in the front seat, I'm off this bus. And that's the shakeout that's happening in this Republican coalition. I don't believe the chamber corporatist folks have anywhere to go. There's no home except full-on fascism. I mean, full-on corporate fascism is the end result of the globalists going over to the socialists. Because if you marry all of the social welfare and the social justice stuff that the left wants with corporate globalism, that's just the textbook definition of fascism. That is just international fascism. So they may go that route, and we'll have to fight that if it happens. But to the extent that that's distasteful, their only other option is to stay in the Republican Party. And, of course, they're going to fight to remain seat number 1. They've got a lot of money, and they want to stay in seat number 1. So that's why defeating people like Flake and Heller and Corker and taking out some budget chairmen on the House side in this next cycle is so important. Because it's not about individual seats. It's not about individual people. It's about this overarching battle to get the chamber and the Warhawks moved to the back seat. And defeating the right people ultimately does that.
So let's hope we can do it.
So I went with a friend to see American Assassin this week. This is a movie based on a Vince Flynn book. And I would give this a B. The best parts of the movie are the first 10 minutes and the last 10 minutes. It has a pretty good opening scene, which grabs the audience by the throat and is well filmed. And the last 10 minutes has a pretty significant climax that requires some CGI that's well done. And I haven't seen this particular scenario played out too much in movies, and therefore it was interesting to watch. In between those parts is basically Tom Clancy, any Tom Clancy movie you've seen rolled in with a Bourne Identity movie. It really was absolutely no difference. And so my problem with that is that there was just absolutely nothing original that happened after the first 5 minutes and before the last 5 minutes. Just the same kind of cookie cutter stuff, the extended fights in which people are able to hit each other 7 or 8 times, and they all know great blocking and flipping maneuvers, and they fight over the knife, and who's going to get killed by the knife, and that struggle goes on for a minute and a half. It's just, you've seen it. You've seen it, and you've seen it. So I wasn't particularly impressed with the movie. I will say, though, the most interesting thing about it was that the basic plot of the movie suggests that, and this is a little bit of a spoiler, but not really. I'm not giving away any key moments of the movie. But as a subtext in the movie is this idea that there's this internal struggle in Iran and that there are good elements of the government trying to thwart the bad elements of the government. And I took notice of this in the movie because I saw this creep up in the Showtime show Homeland as well. They've also tried to suggest this idea that Iran has these good elements that are trying to save the country. It's totally phony, and I noticed that all of these plot points have begun to appear within the liberal commanding heights the moment that the Obama folks started to negotiate with Iran. And they needed this image of Iran as this great villain and supporter of terrorism throughout the Middle East, which it is. This is an accurate portrayal of these folks. They needed that to be curtailed in order to successfully get this Iran deal. Because, of course, they're making the argument that they could make a deal with Iran and that Iran would forego building nuclear weapons to have this great deal with the United States. That, of course, made no sense with our understanding of Iran. So Hollywood and everyone on the left went to work to try to revamp the image of the Iranians. And that's why we're getting, and I'm sure we're going to see it in more films and television shows, we're getting this image of not all Iranians are bad, and there are these really good saintly elements within the government. And again, I have no problem with portraying individual Iranian citizens as good, or that there might be a movement within Iran among its citizens. We saw that when there was an uprising that Obama did absolutely nothing to encourage and was put down viciously by the Iranian government. But this isn't individual Iranian citizens that Hollywood's portraying. These are key high-level members of the government that they're suggesting completely oppose the theocracy that runs Iran. That is just made-up Hollywood crap. There's no way people could be the general in charge of security services and be against the regime unless they were a CIA mole, which is part of what was suggested in Homeland and the rest. It's just phony. And again, going back to my point about you have to watch all of these artworks with your eyes open, that is the message. In the process of entertaining you with a story, they're also trying to sell you something. And what they're trying to sell you in this Vince Flynn movie and what they were trying to sell you in Homeland is the Iranians aren't so bad and they don't really want nuclear weapons. Both of those, I remember Homeland's whole plot was that the Israelis were trying to hoax the United States into believing the Iranians wanted to build a nuclear weapon. It's just nuts because we can see from Iranian actions the kind of violence they foment all over the Middle East. So just be aware of that. I see this stuff all the time, these messages that Hollywood are trying to send. It isn't always just messages about free love and the breakdown of the family and just basically kind of amoral, narcissistic attitudes. That isn't just what Hollywood sells. They also get political. And sometimes it's overt crap when they're just doing movies that are anti-war and anti-the Iraq War and then no one goes to see them, so it's not quite effective. They're much more effective when they get into these big tent movies that aren't selling an anti-war message necessarily, that are entertaining or meant to be entertaining, and they can slip in a little subtle message along the way. So yeah, here's this movie about America and the CIA, and it's a kind of a James Bond movie, but in the middle of it, we're going to slip in this idea that the Iranians aren't so bad. And just like a Pepsi ad doesn't work unless it's run 10,000 times, It isn't about that one message. It's the fact that you notice it in the Homeland show, and then you notice it in this Vince Flynn movie, and I guarantee you I'm going to see it in 4 or 5 more things over the next year or so, all designed to hoax us and to subtly try to change our opinion about the Iranians. Don't buy it. The other one that I see constantly sold as well is this idea that Russia's evil. And some of that is just a holdover from the Cold War. The Russians were a great villain to use for Hollywood to use after they'd sort of exhausted the Nazi villain. There was, the use of the Soviets and these are good villains because they did commit a lot of evil. So some of what you see is a holdover, but you're going to see a lot more Russian villains now that Trump is president and Hollywood is convinced that Russia stole the election for Trump, and they are just buying and selling this whole false line that somehow Russia's the great evil in the world, which is just crap, and we've talked about it before. But that will translate into a lot of Russian villains. You're going to see, this is a very convenient villain for Hollywood because they're white. Most Russians are white. So if you're a Hollywood scriptwriter and you need some villain as part of your plot that's doing extraordinarily bad things, you don't want them to be a Muslim and you don't want them to be some kind of minority because there's all these interest groups that are going to push back on you. So you can pick the Russians because that's like a twofer. You get to reinforce the idea that Russians are evil and that Trump is essentially their puppet, even if that Trump has absolutely nothing to do with the plot. My point is that just by reinforcing Russians as this great evil reinforces this idea that something nefarious is happening. And they're white guys. So, no one's going to give you a hard time about choosing them as the ones trying to explode a nuclear bomb or take over the world or whatever the thing is that's going on in the plot. So expect to see a lot of white Russians essentially as the villains over the next couple of years. You can just take it to the bank. We're just about out of time. This is a labor of love, but we need to grow. I am pleading with you to share this show with just one other person so that we can grow our audience. Trump supporters, you are not alone. Goodbye, Doris.
Goodbye, Matt.